Online, I see many arguments for monarchy growing, especially among people my age. Most of those proponents are Catholic or Orthodox, and so I would like to throw my own reasons for supporting monarchy. As a Protestant, many people are often surprised, and I often see Protestantism equated both by Protestants and Catholic and Orthodox to just being a liberal, lowercase l liberal, in the classical Enlightenment tradition, and I think that's not true. And I'd like to show why I differ, and why I'm not a liberal, and why I'm a monarchist. Stop me if you've ever been in a position like this. Group A are hypocrites. They want Y and complain when Group B argues for Z on this issue, but when it's something different, they argue for Z and disagree with Y. To make it more concrete, think about the times people say, "Are you really pro-life? What about immigrants?" or something like this. Usually it's meant to expose some kind of alleged contradiction in what you believe, but in theory it just reverts and makes both people look bad. All it does expose is that both sides are biased, in theory, or that they misunderstand the other person's position. For the sake of an argument, let's concede that on occasion sometimes this disconnect does occur. Sometimes, because political parties create bias, people are more attached to the policy goal than the argument, so the same argument employed in another context has no purchase on their mind. The rule of law benefits from logic and consistency, and the exact definition of tyranny is when the law makes arbitrary and inconsistent arguments in the name of increasingly biased policy goals. Since the actual world, not governed by the dictates of human constructs, is subject to the rules of logical consistency, it would likely benefit the interaction between humanity and our world to employ logically consistent strategies rather than arbitrary and biased programs. But democracy demands parties, and parties create bias. In order to win an election, you need to convince others to agree with you. This is how you build a coalition and make a political party, and then inherently you will always create bias. The original intention of Enlightenment political philosophers was that a group of interest holders, who already had their own biases to their own property, similar to the operation of a business, they desired that the increase of their shared nation will bring them all some kind of direct monetary profit or monetary gain, and dispel their personal affiliations and biases to the enrichment of them all. At least in this form of quote-unquote democracy, there were alleged incentive structures for logic and order. But this is not how a blind universal suffrage democracy works, or even claims to work. I've never heard a really amazing argument for how we get rid of bias in a universal suffrage democracy system. I still remember, in my AP US History class in high school, reading an argument from the era in our country's history where politicians were debating the expansion of the franchise to non-land-owning males as the first time I began to cynically analyze democracy and progress. The argument came down to the progressives of the time arguing that the franchise should be expanded for the sake of fairness, whatever that means, and those against expanding the franchise said that the poor and uneducated voters will cynically vote for the government to simply give them the wealth of other people, regardless of whether or not this is a wise or logical move in any sense. Of course, when I read this, I immediately thought of the welfare state, which at the time I was vaguely in support of. But when I read that, the counter-argument from the progressives of this era was not, of course they will, but that is good, because, and then whatever the argument for the welfare state is today, instead, the progressives of the time said that this was too cynical, and that patriotism would compel working class or destitute voters to look out for the country's best interests. Of course they would. What frustrated me reading this at the time was realizing that one of them was objectively correct, and they lost this argument, and no one ever cared. The more I looked into history, the more this happened. This happened with the concerns around, for instance, college education. So the conservatives at the time said, if you guarantee loans will be provided to everyone who seeks them, who needs them to go to college, then college prices will skyrocket because the loan providers will know that they can do whatever they want and that the loans will always be guaranteed, and the universities will know that they can charge whatever they want to charge because the loan providers will provide the loans. And it didn't matter that the people were totally correct and that college prices skyrocketed because democracy doesn't work that way. And I'm probably the last conservative to point out the problem of the slippery slope, What I think is important to realize is that the ideas that win in democracy are not predicated on logic or correctness, but just raw mathematics. After we extended suffrage to the working class, it was obvious that they wouldn't admit the argument was wrong. Sorry guys, once they began to vote for the redistribution of the wealth of other people to themselves. Rather, just as it had been in the earlier period, both parties will now simply be forced to make new arguments that appeal to the new voter base. This happened every single time our country has voted to expand the franchise. When women were given the vote, most American women actually opposed being given the right to vote. Now, entire political platforms are justified on who is actually pro-women. Now, a government can't actually be run this way because it has almost nothing to do with administrating and ruling an economy or world power. So instead, political pundits and elected representatives argue very loudly about surface-level political and culture war problems, while delegating all of the actual administration to executive branch functionaries and jurists who are unelected and can actually deal with these problems effectively. Lots of conservatives chafe at the unelected shadow government that actually runs our country, but in some sense these bureaucrats are the only people who could actually run the country, because they can busy themselves with logical empire building without politics. The argument bureaucrats are having right now are 1 million times more consequential and relevant to your life. But if democracy was introduced into these decisions, they would immediately lose all tethering to logic. It's an obvious conundrum, and it reminds you that when you're arguing whether or not you support democracy or not, you're actually arguing, do you support unelected bureaucracies or not? Of course, the systematic problem of our current instantiation of democracy is that only one political party has become the benefactors of that bureaucracy, and so the bureaucracy that actually runs our society has respectfully and appreciatively fed into the success of that party, as any of the laws of politics would obviously predict. But this is a more granular argument for another time. In some sense, democracy is a tool of political evolution. The most important political tool for stability is legitimacy. This is in every system. This is a human universal. Thousands of years of human history have demonstrated the importance of political legitimacy. Most of the horrible tyrants of history were in power during a period of shaky legitimacy. In order to solidify their rule, they resorted to cruelty and wanton elimination of political opponents perceived as more legitimate by other key power holders. When a new king overthrows their brother and takes the throne, he has to kill all of his nephews, and will often impose a kind of totalitarian paranoia to root out potential threats. When an Ottoman sultan came to the throne, it was usually precipitated by a battle royale between all of the sons of the previous sultan, where the most powerful, brutal, cunning, and ambitious son eliminated all of his brothers. Henry IV, who was a usurper, is remembered as a paranoid tyrant, but Henry V, his son, who succeeded to the throne as a young man, and who embodied the archetype of the medieval king incredibly well, reigned largely unopposed and led England into a short-lived golden age. Why was he able to do this? Why did he have that latitude that his dad didn't? Well, he inherited the throne, which is obviously legitimate in the rules of a feudal monarchy. We just have our own rules now. What democracy does is that it asks the entire country who they believe is the most legitimate presidential candidate, and then awards that legitimate candidate with authority. It is a quaint and simple way of creating legitimate rulers, and therefore general political stability. The quickest path to a civil war in a democracy is a contested election. It is the democratic equivalent of the last king's secret legitimate heir being discovered in hiding. Of course, many democracies abuse our expectation of legitimacy, and many political movements abuse our desire for personal power to discredit elections. Even the dictators of the 20th and 21st century were aware that they had to mime the current schema for legitimacy, popular sovereignty. The problem with popular sovereignty, however, is that it is a cyclical argument. The current regime is legitimate because it is popular, and it is popular because it is legitimate. Of course, this truth is a component of all of the schemas of legitimacy, this cycle of legitimacy and popularity, but it is the only element of the democratic popular sovereignty schema for legitimacy, as opposed to all other criteria of possible legitimacy. An unelected king who is legitimate and meets the expectations for rule of the majority of his citizens will be popular because he is legitimate, of course. The way we will know that he is legitimate is that he is popularly seen as fulfilling the job description. It's not identical. Buried underneath every government is an archetype of leadership. When a leader fulfills the common expected archetype of leadership, he will be popular. So even in a democracy, especially in a democratic election for a leader, rather than a direct democracy on every issue by fiat, what we are really pulling for is an archetype of leadership. People are often offended by voters who like a candidate because, quote, they could grab a beer with him, unquote, and they would rather people vote for candidates based on their actual stances on important issues. When you look at government from the lens of legitimacy rather than some weird poll on everyone's opinions, the understanding that even subconsciously we all understand that every political decision is not a query on popular opinion, that leadership is about a fulfillment of an archetype, is obvious. It's obvious because no human being thinks that the majority of people are correct on any issue by virtue of their sheer numbers. If anything, people believe that arguments are correct because they are logical and fact-based, and they hope or believe that facts and logic will sway the majority of people to see reason. But there are obvious obfuscating factors that are constantly throwing themselves in the way of that kind of a schema. Not only deliberate misinformation will block that, but just mistakes. People will misreport things. Facts will be misrepresented all the time, and people won't be able to make logical decisions based off of facts. In fact, they won't even sometimes be able to gather all of the facts properly and just have a misshapen, semi-true reflection of occasional facts. An even worse and obvious factor that will always intervene in any system where there are groups of people is confirmation bias. You are likely to believe the facts selectively and not wholesale, based on what already confirms what you believed when you went in. Which brings us back to the problem of factions. Parties and factions just create bias, and bias obfuscates logic. This is obvious. So if that is the end goal of democracy, that is the understanding that's obviously going to happen in democracy, if that is the only justifiable legitimacy to democracy, why not rather favor a system that is more direct? The imposition of standardized blind rules which impose logical consistency is the real strength of any legal system. That was all we could hope for in the law, is that it is clear and consistent. No matter the cultural context, arbitrary rule is the death of all legitimacy. In some sense, the ideal leader would fulfill the cultural expectation of leadership and also would respect the authority of the laws that came before and keep consistent application of these laws. While the second requirement can be considered the rule of law, which all reasonable political scientists are advocates for, the first requirement is more vague. What does the particular society in question actually expect from their ruler? Why do they expect what they expect? Many cultures spend a great deal of time painting pictures of what a leader is in mythology and epic poetry. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which is one of the oldest epics we have access to, is basically a long tale about a leader realizing his proper role as a leader. Every society has a value hierarchy, and making those values explicit is a social function of archetypes. If these archetypes are explicit, people in society can busy themselves with trying to conform to their society's range of archetypes. In a meritocratic system, and in many early-stage democracies, the population then chooses from an assortment of people and asks not only if they agree with their stances on various political issues, but if they have ascended that value hierarchy. This is why George Washington is remembered as a good leader, even though very few Americans can name any of his particular political stances. If anything, they appreciate that he isn't political. He was a military leader and a Cincinnatus who was not power-hungry, something we rightly value, and in some sense we venerate these people because they exemplify virtue. And then by venerating them, we reinforce the values we chose them for. We create a value hierarchy with that person, or more accurately, our representation of that person, our perception of that person, on the top of that value hierarchy. However, democracies intentionally, or at least incidentally, slowly erode these hierarchies. What ends up being muddled into these feedback loops is voters asking if the leader reflects themselves. The question of, do they align with me and do they inspire me, gets muddled. Slowly, leaders begin to reflect even the failings of their democratic base, and slowly the social hierarchy begins to fragment. Since virtue is singular and narrow, but each person has their own unique sins and failings, these democratic hierarchies become arbitrary, confusing, and muddled. What moral failings we do all share, like greed and lust and pride, begin to demonstrate themselves as things which promote you up the hierarchy of popularity, and those sins replace our values. The reason I am a monarchist is because leaders, by their very nature, are uncommon. Virtue is rare, and failure is common. If something is good, it will necessarily be uncommon. If something is virtuous, it will likely be difficult. Usually some period of failing, unelected leadership creates democracy, because the population and the power holders in the society recognize that the current leader doesn't have what it takes to be a leader. So, says the democratic instinct, why don't we just agree on someone who does have what it takes to be leader and make them leader? This solution works in the short run but degrades in the long run. What we examine as the slippery slope of progress in modernity is actually just the obvious effect of democratic politics. Society will require less virtue of people over time and seek to appeal to larger quantities of people rather than qualities of people. This is why, despite Martin Luther King Jr.'s very clear appeal for civil rights on the basis that it would allow us to judge people on the basis of the content of their character, something truly virtuous and necessary to a functioning society, modern intersectional politics has devolved into an appeal to innate traits that take no effort to acquire, like your inborn race. You also see this growing populist appeal to racial politics on the right. Rather than appeal to virtue, democracy facilitates an appeal to commonality. This is why most traditional monarchies of old countries, rather than being a bare-bones appeal to bloodlines, as its greatest detractors always cynically boil them down to, are full of elaborate court ceremony and cultural events and traditions and hierarchies of nobilities meant to cultivate a way of life. Rather than selecting someone already highly valued, an entire society is devoted to inculcating those virtues in a single person. It is not a perfect system, and often failed, especially in the unstable Middle Ages, but 19th and 20th century monarchies, which were the most likely to be abolished, have actually had immense success in this project. Rather than a short-sighted process of leadership selection with a long-term guarantee of failure and decay, monarchy is a long-term appeal to order and virtue with inevitable and occasional hiccups. Every democratic society includes a complicated constitution intended to avoid the downsides of democracy, and people assume these safeguards as a necessary part of the entire system. The same is true about monarchy. Most monarchies inherit a long, unwritten constitution of traditions that are thrown out at their own peril. Most coronation ceremonies are incredibly carefully worded ceremonies, which remind the leader of their subordination to God and their people. As many people were reminded during the recent coronation of King Charles, English monarchs swear always to be servants, as Christ was. It is in the context of monarchy that Christianity makes the most sense. What Christ is, sociologically, is the archetype of the king. In that way, he is the unshakable information of the value hierarchy of all Christian societies. No doubt, it is not coincidental that the most well-functioning democratic societies were also Christian, as Christ served as a resisting force against the natural decline and destruction of value hierarchies. In that same way, Christianity also safeguards us against the excesses of monarchy. If Christ is kept as the fundamental archetype of the king, which the English coronation ceremony makes explicit, then the greatest virtue of all is self-sacrifice. The greatest among us was a servant to all. What I think is becoming increasingly evident in our society, regardless of your political persuasion, is that we have to sort out our value hierarchy before we finally return to the important administrative and legal questions that are necessary for running a society. Monarchism sorts that out so that we can go back to arguing about marginal tax rates and speed limits. The way our social world is governed in the modern world is one-sided. All societies have to find a way to regulate social conduct in some way, to say what is acceptable and what is unacceptable. Most healthy societies order these principles into two basic elements. The first, which our society maintains to this day, is the punishment of pariahs. There are some people who are too far gone from acceptable behavior that they have to be excised from society. Their lifestyle is not reconcilable with the body politic, and they are effectively dangerous. These are criminals and what other societies would call degeneracy or debauchery, usually something that's disgusting or thrown out of society because people don't want it to be included as normal. The second, alternative, mirroring element are positive archetypes. Postmodern societies totally reject all archetypes, or as they call it, stereotypes, as they have been rebranded. Normal, healthy societies are full of archetypes, like the warrior and the king and the housewife and the barkeeper and the blacksmith and the old crone or the princess. There are probably hundreds, if not thousands, of subconscious and conscious archetypes in any culture that paint a complicated web of interrelated interaction. The knight loyally serves the king, who rewards and respects his loyal subjects. The soldier comes home to his loving girlfriend in like the 1950s post-war society. Through a decentralized web of action, these archetypes play themselves out and evolve, and the many cultural adherents give their lives purpose by trying, and often falling short, of these various ideals. these archetypes, on the other end of the spectrum of the social world from the pariah. So they pull citizens into a productive, admirable behaviors that signal to the rest of society that if you do this, we will praise you. Because if everyone in society lived out these archetypes perfectly, we would have total social harmony. It's the opposite of the punishment of pariahs. When we punish a pariah, we say, don't do this. When we uphold these archetypes, we say, do this. This is why we give medals to war heroes and Oscars to actors. Not because they produce any economic good, although sometimes that follows, but because they created social goods that we value. Now, no society has ever lived up to the fairy tales they create, but the fairy tales do, and they often bring people into a more ordered world than worlds without them. The social liberal experiment we have been living through is the fruitless attempt to stop telling people what they should be and giving them noble archetypes to live up to, but instead setting outer boundaries and telling people to be themselves, unless, of course, they are pedophiles or rapists, because that's too far. But without any positive archetypes, which usually call people up towards virtues, these emotional wanderers trying to find their authentic self end up drifting away and from virtue and towards whatever comes naturally. Rather than saying, just don't be a pedophile and that's fine, we would say, strive to be a father and a mother. This is the proper ordered sexual relationship, here it is, rather than just telling you what you can't do. But because archetypes are higher, things that we will never actually be able to achieve and get the pat on the back that we so desire, we've gotten rid of them, and we've told people to do whatever comes naturally and just avoid the totally unacceptable behaviors. But in case you haven't noticed, the things that come naturally to most people are cruel, barbaric, and short-sighted. In order to accommodate an ever-increasing cultural base of people who have fewer and fewer virtues, we are forced to draw the boundary of pariahs further and further from the center of the social world. More and more people previously seen as hedonistic pariahs are forced into the world of social acceptability. At a certain point, the only people who still remain pariahs are the people who do the socially inconvenient work of pointing out that the other groups of people, who usually used to be pariahs, should be pariahs again. The reason these new pariah hunters are also wrong is because they have adopted the misshapen social form of postmodern liberalism, where we just play a massive chaotic ball pit with boundaries that only exclude the absolute worst of humanity. The actual solution to most social dysfunction is not marginalization, but providing positive, attainable, and rewarding archetypes to live out in your life. In a healthy society, the only people being punished for social dysfunction are those who have already rejected society's hundreds of available and acceptable archetypes. The king, monarchy, ceremony, festivals, and social events and customs that are absolutely necessary to preserve the instantiation of these archetypes. Medieval jousts are a good example. They seem to be a pointless waste of time unless you understand how vital it is to maintain members of your society who live out the knightly archetype despite the fact that your country is not currently in a war. Contrary to popular assertion, those minute archetypal things play themselves out in very real economic and administrative consequences. The minute administrative details of society and government are important. They're more important than the weird culture war arguments we get obsessed with. My greatest reluctance in being a public monarchist is that in a realistic sense, in the American context especially, it is a totally impractical, irrelevant stance. In general, I think it is a waste and a distraction to advocate for hopeless and impractical ideas or solutions. And instead, I would suggest we focus on substantial political arguments in the here and now. But I am increasingly convinced that in the United States, a parallel society is being established alongside the one where monarchy is impossible. Questions are bubbling up about what precisely this new society should look like. In older videos from the early days of my channel, I tentatively called this new society Nation B. While progressives and more left radicals are also proposing a very new social order, they intend to project that social order onto the existing society. They are taking Nation A, as it is, in one direction, and the fallout and the dribblings are left behind in the second nation as they do so. A general common understanding of what Nation B opposes is understood. It's Nation A and the direction that we're going in. But as in the birth of any new nation, which is still up in the air, about the precise details of what Nation B is actually going to look like in a positive sense rather than in a negative sense. In whatever we end up building, there will have to be a framework and then a methodology for us to deal with the minutiae of the day-to-day administration of this society and of our social forms and functions. My suggestion is that along with the sociological advantages of a monarch I already outlined, let's return to the conundrums that I began with. Let's say there is a monarch in charge of the politics of a nation, debating abortion and lockdowns and immigration, and we're wrestling with the complex issues of what a life is and how much we should be giving up to deal with other people's lives. A king, whose authority is absolute and above everyone, will lay out a broad and consistent platform for dealing with all of these issues, rather than dealing with them from a partisan basis of making certain demographic groups in his country happy to the exclusion of the other demographics. The king will just look at these things from the most bird's eye view possible. He's on the top of society. All he wants is stability and peace and prosperity. He is literally the owner of the country. The country is like his personal property. The same logic the Founding Fathers used to argue that a number of shareholders will always put away bias or have the best incentive to put away bias in favor of the best interest of the country because they are literal stakeholders as landowners. The king also is. Taxation feeds his coffers. So peace, stability, and order are his best motivation and his only motivation. If we had a king or a queen at the top of our political order, rather than being a temporary victory for one of the factions in our society, there would be a figure who embodies the entire body politic, whose interests are not securing as many victories for Team A in the next 4 years as possible, and not worrying about the consequences of their policies in 5 years or more, but instead a king whose long-term goals are peace and prosperity and a stable country to give off to his children, who will take up the reins after him. It's one of the most natural organization structures in human history. It's the family, and it's what we all can understand. It's what we can all sympathize with. Think how every American, Briton, person through most of the Western world has an opinion on the British royal family members. We know them. We kind of grow up with them sometimes. Depending on your age, you have the royals that are in your age bracket. Lots of people have very strong opinions about the new King of England, Charles. Some negative, some very positive, some very mixed. Regardless of what you think about certain members of a monarchy, this proposal isn't to say that there can be no bad monarchs, the same way that I don't think a proponent of democracy would say that all democracies make the right decisions all the time. Instead, it's making an argument for the social role that a monarch will always have and be necessary to have. The fact that you can identify that one king is failing at the archetype of king doesn't mean that we should get rid of the archetype of king in the society. In fact, because you can tell that they're failing, tells and shows how important the archetype actually is.